The silent plea. The sun poured golden rays into the courtroom through high arched windows, casting long shadows over the polished wooden floors. The room was abuzz with hushed whispers, the shuffle of papers, and the subtle hum of anticipation. At the heart of it all sat Leila Johnson, a 10-year-old girl whose small frame seemed swallowed by the chair she occupied at the long, imposing table. Her dark brown curls framed her solemn face, and her large, expressive eyes were fixed downward, as if trying to disappear into the floor. On either side of her were Matthew and Emily Carter, a couple in their late 30s with a pristine appearance and practiced charm. Emily wore a pastel suit that screamed perfection, while Matthew's dark blazer and crisp white shirt gave him an air of professionalism. They exchanged smiles with familiar faces in the crowd, their polished demeanor a sharp contrast to Leila's quiet tension. The Carters had been fostering Leila for 8 months and were now petitioning to adopt her. To the outside world, they were the picture of an ideal family, successful, affluent, and loving. But there was something in Leila's demeanor, the way she avoided their touches and flinched at their words, that hinted at another story. At the bench, Judge Vivian Hastings, a stern yet compassionate woman in her 60s, reviewed the case file. Her sharp eyes darted between the glowing references written about the Carters and Leila's withdrawn behavior in the courtroom. "Court is now in session," Judge Hastings announced, her voice slicing through the murmurs. As the formalities proceeded, the Carters' lawyer presented their case. He painted a picture of a perfect home, filled with opportunity, love, and care. Matthew spoke warmly about their plans for Leila's future, a private education, travel opportunities, and access to the best resources money could buy. Emily dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief as she recounted their first meeting with Leila. "We knew from the moment we met her that she belonged with us," she said, her voice trembling. "She's the daughter we've always prayed for." The courtroom seemed captivated, nodding along as if attending a heartwarming movie premiere. But Judge Hastings was less easily swayed. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she addressed Leila directly. "Miss Johnson," the judge said, her tone gentle but firm, "can you please look at me?" Leila hesitated. Her small hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Slowly, she raised her head, meeting the judge's gaze with eyes that brimmed with unshed tears. "Do you understand why we're here today?" the judge asked. Leila nodded but didn't speak. "I need to ask you a very important question," the judge continued. "Do you want to be adopted by the Carters?" The courtroom fell into a deep silence. Even the usual rustling of papers ceased. All eyes were on Leila, the air thick with anticipation. She opened her mouth to speak but hesitated, her lips trembling. Her gaze flicked to Emily and Matthew, who smiled at her with practiced warmth. Then her eyes returned to Judge Hastings, and with a voice barely audible, she said one word: "Help." The word was a whisper, but it landed like a thunderclap. A collective gasp rippled through the room. A pen clattered to the floor, the sound jarringly loud in the silence that followed. "Excuse me," Judge Hastings said, her eyes sharpening. "What did you say?" Leila's gaze dropped again, her small shoulders trembling. "Help," she repeated, this time louder, her voice cracking. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted instantly. The polished veneer of the Carters' smiles cracked as Emily gasped, and Matthew shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Judge Hastings studied Leila intently, her years of experience allowing her to detect the tremor of fear in the girl's voice. Her gaze snapped to the Carters, who sat frozen in place, their polished smiles now replaced with tension. "Court is adjourned until further notice," the judge declared, banging her gavel. Her voice carried an edge of urgency as she leaned toward her clerk. "Contact the authorities and Child Protective Services immediately. No one leaves this room." The bailiffs moved swiftly to secure the exits. The Carters exchanged a panicked glance, their previously composed demeanor unraveling. "Your Honor," Matthew began, standing abruptly. "This is a misunderstanding. Leila's just nervous about all the attention." Emily nodded vigorously. Yes, she's shy. She doesn't mean what she's saying. Sit down, Mr. Carter, Judge Hastings ordered, her tone ice-cold. And remove your hand from the child. Matthew's hand, which had instinctively reached for Lila's shoulder, dropped to his side. His jaw tightened, but he complied. The tension in the room was palpable. Lila, trembling, clutched the edge of the table as if it were a lifeline. Judge Hastings stood, her black robes billowing as she moved toward the frightened child. Her voice softened as she knelt beside Lila. "You're safe now," the judge said quietly, her kind eyes meeting Lila's. "No one can hurt you here, but I need you to tell me, who are you asking for help?" Lila's lips quivered as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but her words pierced the air. "They hurt me," she said, her voice breaking. "And they hurt my brother." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Reporters scribbled furiously, and onlookers whispered heatedly. The judge's face darkened, her expression a mixture of anger and determination. "Officer, take the Carters into custody," she ordered. "I want this investigated immediately." The bailiffs moved quickly, their authoritative presence forcing the Carters to remain seated. Emily burst into tears, wailing loudly, while Matthew erupted into protests of innocence. "This is absurd," he bellowed. "You're making a mistake." But Judge Hastings had already turned her attention back to Lila, her voice steady and reassuring. "Tell me about your brother," she said gently. "He's in the basement," Lila whispered, her voice so faint it was almost lost in the commotion. "They won't let him out." Judge Hastings froze, her face betraying a flash of shock. She stood abruptly, her voice cutting through the noise. "Send officers to the Carter residence immediately," she commanded. "This hearing is suspended until further notice." As the room erupted into controlled chaos, Lila clung to the judge's robe, her small frame trembling. For the first time in months, she felt the faint flicker of hope. Shadows of the basement. The police cruisers sped through the quiet suburban streets, their sirens piercing the tranquil evening. The Carter residence sat at the end of a winding cul-de-sac, a large, pristine house with immaculate landscaping. On the outside, it appeared perfect, a testament to the life Matthew and Emily Carter had built. But now, the serene facade was shattered as officers stormed the premises. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The house's lavish decor, crystal chandeliers, antique furniture, and abstract art pieces, felt cold and uninviting. The officers moved with purpose, systematically sweeping the rooms as they searched for any sign of the alleged basement confinement. "Basement's locked," one officer called out, rattling a sturdy door at the end of a hallway. His voice echoed through the cavernous house. "We'll need a warrant to force it open." Another officer, Detective Jenna Hart, approached the door with a furrowed brow. Her experience told her something wasn't right. "Get the warrant expedited," she ordered, "and get the child welfare team here immediately." Back at the courthouse, Judge Hastings had escorted Lila into her chambers, away from the commotion of the courtroom. The little girl sat curled in a large leather chair, clutching a blanket a bailiff had given her. The judge knelt beside her, her stern demeanor softened into compassion. "You're safe now, Lila," Judge Hastings reassured her. "But I need you to tell me about your brother. What's his name?" Lila sniffled, her voice barely audible. "Jacob." "Jacob," the judge repeated gently. "How old is he?" 8, Lila whispered. Her hands gripped the blanket tightly, as if holding onto it could shield her from the horrors she was recalling. "They said he was bad, that he deserved to be punished." Judge Hastings' jaw tightened, but she kept her voice calm. "What did they do to him, Lila?" Lila's eyes filled with tears, and her small body trembled. "They keep him down there, in the dark. He cries, but they don't let him out. They said, if I tell anyone, they'll do the same to me." The judge's heart ached at the girl's words, but she remained composed. She motioned for her clerk, who quickly returned with a pad of paper and a pen. "Lila, "I'm going to make sure Jacob is okay," the judge promised. "But I need you to be brave a little longer. Can you tell me anything else about the basement?" Leela nodded slowly. "It smells bad. Like rotten food and dirt. And it's cold. They lock him in a little room." The judge wrote down every word, her mind already racing with the implications. She handed the notes to the clerk with a pointed look. "Get this to the officers at the Carter residence immediately." At the Carter house, the officers continued their search while awaiting the warrant. Detective Hart's instincts told her to stay near the basement door. She examined the surroundings carefully, noting the spotless floors and polished surfaces, a stark contrast to Leela's description. "Something's off here," Hart muttered to herself. Her flashlight beam traced the edges of the doorframe, revealing faint scratches around the lock, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. The warrant arrived within minutes, and the officers didn't waste any time. Using a battering ram, they broke through the heavy door. The basement stairs creaked under their weight as they descended into the dimly lit space. The air grew colder with each step, carrying with it a damp, musty odor. At the bottom of the stairs, the flashlight beams revealed a scene that made the officers pause. The basement was divided into two sections, a storage area filled with boxes and a locked metal door at the far end. Detective Hart approached the door cautiously, her hand on the holster of her weapon. "Get the bolt cutters," she ordered. Another officer stepped forward, and within moments, the padlock snapped open. When the door swung inward, a small figure huddled in the corner of a tiny windowless room. The boy's thin frame was draped in tattered clothing, and his arms were wrapped around his knees. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with fear. "Jacob," Detective Hart called out gently, kneeling to his level. "My name is Jenna. I'm here to help you." The boy flinched at first, but as the officer's calm voice reached him, he began to relax slightly. Tears welled in his eyes as he nodded. "We're going to get you out of here," she said, motioning for a paramedic to approach. "You're safe now." At the courthouse, Judge Hastings received the call she'd been waiting for. Her expression remained stoic as she listened, but a flicker of relief crossed her face when she heard Jacob had been found alive. "Thank you, Detective," she said, ending the call. She turned to Leela, who sat anxiously on the couch in her chambers. "Jacob's safe, Lila. They found him." Leela's eyes widened, and a small, hesitant smile broke through her tears. "He's okay. He's going to be okay," the judge reassured her. "The officers are taking care of him now." For the first time, Leela seemed to relax, her small body sagging against the cushions. Judge Hastings felt a pang of sadness at the thought of what the siblings had endured, but she knew their journey wasn't over yet. The news of the Carter scandal spread quickly. Reporters camped outside the courthouse and the Carter residence, hungry for details about the couple who had hidden their dark secrets behind a perfect facade. Meanwhile, Leela and Jacob were placed in temporary protective custody together. The first time they saw each other, Jacob ran to Leela, clinging to her as if afraid she might disappear. She wrapped her arms around him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I told them," she whispered to him. "I told them, and now we're free." Detective Hart and Judge Hastings watched the reunion from a distance, their hearts heavy but hopeful. They knew the road ahead would be challenging for the siblings, but they were determined to see justice served. Over the next several weeks, the investigation into the Carters unraveled a web of deceit and abuse. Evidence revealed a history of manipulative behavior, including exploiting the foster system to gain control over vulnerable children. The couple's polished reputation in the community crumbled as former associates came forward with stories of their cruelty and lies. In the safety of their new foster home, Leela and Jacob began to heal. With the help of counselors, they learned to trust again and reclaim their sense of security. Lila's bravery in speaking up became a source of inspiration for others, and her story sparked a larger conversation about the need for reform in the foster care system. For Leela, the journey wasn't just about survival. It was about finding her voice, and using it to protect others. And for Jacob, it was about rediscovering the light after years of darkness. As the legal proceedings against the Carters moved forward, the siblings held on to each other, their bond stronger than ever. They had faced the shadows together and emerged into the light, ready to build a brighter future. The threads began to unravel. The courtroom buzzed with a sense of unease. The trial of Matthew and Emily Carter was about to begin, and the world was watching. Media outlets had dubbed it the perfect facade trial, and the public clamored for every detail. Cameramen and reporters gathered outside the courthouse, shouting questions as attorneys and witnesses entered. Inside, the tension was palpable. The judge presiding over the case, Judge Naomi Fletcher, was known for her no-nonsense demeanor and dedication to justice. As she adjusted her glasses and reviewed the preliminary evidence, her expression was as unreadable as a stone carving. Leila and Jacob sat with their foster parents, the Sanders, in a reserved section of the courtroom. Lila's new foster mother, Jessica Sanders, rested a comforting hand on her shoulder. Jacob clung to a small stuffed bear, his wide eyes darting nervously around the crowded room. "You don't have to do this alone," Jessica whispered to Leila, her voice steady and reassuring. "We're here for you." Leila nodded but felt the weight of what was to come. She would be called to testify against the Carters, and the prospect of facing them again made her stomach churn. Across the room, Matthew and Emily Carter entered, flanked by their legal team. They no longer exuded the polished confidence that had once defined them. Matthew's jaw was clenched, his previously immaculate suit slightly wrinkled. Emily's face was pale, her usual poise replaced with visible tension. They sat at the defense table, whispering furiously with their attorneys. As the trial began, the prosecution wasted no time in painting a grim picture of the Carters' actions. Lead prosecutor Rachel Monroe addressed the jury with conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice firm and measured, "this case is not just about the abuse of two innocent children. It is about a calculated betrayal of trust. The defendants, Matthew and Emily Carter, used their wealth and influence to exploit the foster system, presenting themselves as model citizens while engaging in despicable acts behind closed doors." Monroe detailed the evidence against the Carters, from the discovery of Jacob in the basement to the testimonies of former house staff like Maria Diaz, who had come forward after the initial arrests. Maria's statements revealed a chilling pattern of control and cruelty, including how the Carters would isolate their foster children, manipulate them, and punish them for disobedience. When Maria took the stand, she spoke with a mix of regret and determination. "I stayed silent for too long," she said, her voice trembling. "I saw things I should have reported. I thought I'd lose my job. But these children, they didn't deserve what happened to them." Her testimony was a turning point, giving the jury a glimpse into the hidden horrors of the Carter household. The day Leila took the stand was one of the most anticipated moments of the trial. As she walked to the witness box, the room fell silent. She felt the weight of every eye on her, journalists scribbling furiously, spectators leaning forward in their seats, and the Carters staring at her with a mixture of anger and desperation. The bailiff swore her in, and she sat stiffly, clutching the edges of the wooden stand. Her heart pounded as she met the prosecutor's kind gaze. "Leila," Monroe began, her voice soft but steady, "can you tell the court about your time living with the Carters?" Leila hesitated, glancing at Jacob, who watched her with wide, trusting eyes. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. They acted nice in front of people," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But when we were alone, they were different. They said I wasn't good enough, that Jacob wasn't good enough. They'd lock him in the basement when he cried or didn't follow their rules." Monroe's voice remained calm and encouraging. "Did they ever threaten you?" Leila nodded. "They said if I told anyone, they'd send us away. They said no one else would want us." Her words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. In the defense section, Emily dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her tears seeming more performative than genuine. Matthew's face remained stony, but his clenched fists betrayed his anger. When Monroe handed the questioning over to the defense attorney, Gerald Reed, he approached the stand with a practiced smile meant to disarm. "Leila," Reed began, his tone smooth, "you've been through a lot, haven't you?" Leila nodded hesitantly. "And you're angry with the Carters, aren't you?" "It's understandable. You were scared, and you've been told things about them since this investigation started." Leila frowned, her brow furrowing. "I'm not angry. I'm sad. For Jacob. For what they did to us." Reed's smile faltered for a split second before he continued. "But isn't it true that the Carters provided for you? Gave you a beautiful home? Sent you to a good school?" "They gave me things," Leila replied, her voice firmer now. "But they didn't give me love. Or safety." Her words silenced the courtroom. Reed retreated, clearly rattled. As the trial progressed, more damning evidence emerged. Financial records showed how the Carters had exploited foster care stipends, funneling money meant for the children into their personal accounts. Testimonies from other foster families revealed how the Carters had blocked attempts to place Jacob and Leila with other homes, using their influence to ensure the siblings remained under their control. The most chilling piece of evidence, however, was the diary Leila had secretly kept. The entries, written in a shaky but determined hand, detailed the daily emotional and physical abuse she and Jacob had endured. Monroe presented it to the jury, reading excerpts aloud. "They said Jacob was a bad boy and had to be punished," Monroe read, her voice steady despite the disturbing content. "They locked him in the basement again. I tried to help, but they said I'd go there too." The jury's expressions ranged from horror to outrage. It was clear the diary had a profound impact. Outside the courthouse, a growing crowd of supporters rallied for Leila and Jacob, signs reading "Justice for the Johnson siblings" and "Protect our children" waved in the autumn breeze. Community leaders called for systemic changes to the foster care system, demanding stricter oversight and more thorough background checks for foster parents. Among the crowd, Jessica Sanders stood with her own sign, her presence a quiet but powerful statement of support. She had seen Leila's strength firsthand and knew the importance of amplifying her voice. The trial's closing arguments were impassioned. Monroe emphasized the need for accountability, urging the jury to see through the Carters' polished exterior. They hid behind their wealth and reputation, she said, her voice ringing with conviction. But no amount of money can erase the pain they inflicted on these children. Justice demands that we hold them accountable. Reed's closing argument was less convincing, relying on character testimonials and appeals to the Carters' prior good deeds. But it was clear the tide had turned against his clients. When the jury delivered its verdict, the courtroom was silent. "On the charge of child abuse, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of unlawful imprisonment, we find the defendants guilty." As the judge read each count, the weight of justice settled over the room. Matthew's face turned pale, his bravado crumbling, while Emily sobbed quietly into her hands. Leila and Jacob sat together, their foster parents on either side. Jessica squeezed Leila's hand as tears streamed down the girl's face, not of sadness, but of relief. The Carters were sentenced to decades in prison, their wealth and influence unable to shield them from the consequences of their actions. Outside the courthouse, Leila addressed the crowd of supporters for the first time. Standing on the courthouse steps, her voice carried with newfound strength. "This isn't just about me and Jacob," she said. "It's about every child who feels unheard and unprotected. We need to do better, to believe them, to protect them, to give them hope." Her words ignited a wave of applause and cheers. Among the crowd, Jacob smiled for the first time in what felt like forever, his small hand clasped tightly in Leila's. They had faced the shadows and emerged into the light, together, stronger than ever. Rebuilding the pieces. The weeks following the Carters' sentencing brought a quiet sense of relief to Leila and Jacob. The trial had been a grueling experience, forcing them to relive their darkest memories in front of strangers, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope and healing. For now, the siblings remained with the Sanders, their new foster family. Jessica and Michael Sanders were everything the Carters were not: warm, patient, and genuine. Their modest suburban home was a stark contrast to the opulent but cold mansion the siblings had once endured. Here, the walls were adorned with family photos and children's drawings, and the air was filled with the comforting sense of home-cooked meals and fresh laundry. Leela often found herself in the kitchen with Jessica, helping to bake cookies or prepare dinner. It was during one of these quiet moments that Jessica gently broached the subject that had been on her mind. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Jessica asked as she rolled out cookie dough on the counter. Leela paused, her hand stilling over the cookie cutter she held. "Better," she admitted softly. "It's different here. It feels real." Jessica nodded, her eyes warm and encouraging. "You've been through so much, Lila. It's okay to take things one step at a time." Leela glanced at the doorway, where Jacob played with building blocks in the living room under Michael's watchful eye. "Jacob's smiling more," she said with a small smile of her own. "That makes me happy." Jessica reached out and gently squeezed Leela's hand. "You're both safe now. That's what matters." But safety wasn't the same as healing. Lila's nights were still haunted by nightmares of the basement and the Carters' harsh voices. Jacob often woke up crying, his small body trembling with fear that he couldn't yet put into words. The Sanders were patient, sitting with them through sleepless nights, reading stories to calm them, and encouraging them to talk about their feelings when they were ready. One afternoon, Lila was rummaging through a box of her old belongings when she came across the small battered notebook she'd used as a diary during her time with the Carters. Her heart clenched as she flipped through the pages, the scrawled entries bringing back a flood of memories. She hesitated before bringing it to Jessica, unsure if she should share it. Jessica looked up from her knitting as Leela approached. "What's that, honey?" Leela handed her the notebook, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's my diary. From before." Jessica took the notebook with care, flipping through the pages with an expression of quiet reverence. "Would you like me to read it?" she asked gently. Leila nodded, sitting beside her on the couch. As Jessica read the entries aloud, her voice steady and calm, Leila felt a strange mixture of pain and relief. It hurt to hear the words she'd written in those dark moments, but it also felt like shedding a heavy burden she'd carried alone for too long. When Jessica finished, she wrapped an arm around Lila's shoulders. "You're so brave for writing all this down," she said. "It shows how strong you are, even when things were so hard." Leela leaned into Jessica's side, her voice trembling. "Do you think sharing it could help other kids? Kids like me and Jacob?" Jessica's eyes lit up with pride. "I think it could help a lot of people, Leela. If you're ready, we can find a way to share your story." Over the next few weeks, Leela worked with Jessica and Michael to turn her diary into a tool for advocacy. Jessica reached out to a local organization that supported foster children and survivors of abuse, and they connected Lila with resources to share her story safely and effectively. Lila was hesitant at first, unsure if she could speak in front of a crowd, but her determination to help other children gave her the courage to try. The first time she spoke publicly was at a small community event hosted by the organization. She stood on a makeshift stage in a local park, clutching the microphone tightly as she faced the small crowd. Jessica stood nearby, giving her a reassuring nod. "My name is Leela," she began, her voice shaking, "and I want to tell you about my journey." As she spoke about her experiences, the fear she'd carried for so long began to lift. She saw tears in the eyes of some audience members, while others nodded in silent encouragement. When she finished, the applause was deafening, and several people approached her to thank her for her bravery. Among them was a social worker named Erin Daniels, who had worked in the foster care system for over a decade. Erin was visibly moved by Leela's story. "You have a gift, Leela," she said. "Your voice can make a difference. If you're interested, I'd love to help you get involved in advocacy work." Leela's journey into advocacy quickly gained momentum. She started volunteering with the organization, attending workshops and meeting other young survivors. She began writing articles about her experiences, which were published on the organization's website. Her story resonated with readers, sparking conversations about the need for systemic changes in the foster care system. As Leela found her voice, Jacob began to thrive as well. He started therapy with a kind, patient counselor named Dr. Alicia Grant, who specialized in working with children. Through play therapy and gentle conversations, Jacob began to open up about his fears and memories. One day, he proudly showed Leela a drawing he'd made in therapy. It depicted the two of them holding hands in front of a bright yellow house. Above them, a sun beamed down, and a rainbow stretched across the sky. "That's us," Jacob explained, his voice small but steady. "In our new home." Leela hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "It's beautiful, Jacob, just like you." Months later, Leela stood in front of a packed auditorium at a statewide foster care summit. The event had drawn policymakers, social workers, and foster families from across the region. Leela had been invited as a keynote speaker, a role she had never imagined for herself. As she stepped up to the podium, she glanced at the front row, where Jacob sat between Jessica and Michael, his smile brighter than ever. She took a deep breath and began. "When I was younger, I thought no one would ever hear my voice," she said, her voice steady and strong. "But I've learned that even the smallest voice can make a difference when it's given the chance to be heard." She spoke about her experiences, her healing journey, and her hopes for the future. She called for better oversight of the foster care system, more training for social workers, and greater support for foster children and families. Her words were met with a standing ovation, and she left the stage feeling a sense of purpose she'd never known before. Later that evening, as the Sanders family returned home, Jacob tugged on Leela's sleeve. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. Leela smiled down at him, her heart swelling with love. "I'm proud of us," she replied. "We're a team, remember." As they sat together in the warm glow of the living room, surrounded by their new family, Leela realized that the pain of the past would always be a part of their story, but it no longer defined them. Together, they were rebuilding their lives, one piece at a time, from survivors to advocates. It had been 2 years since the Carter's trial ended, and Leela and Jacob's lives had transformed in ways they never thought possible. The scars of the past hadn't completely healed, but the siblings had found a new normal, surrounded by love and support. Their foster parents, Jessica and Michael Sanders, were in the process of legally adopting them, and the house now felt like home. But for Leela, there was an ever-present desire to do more. Her experiences had lit a fire within her, a need to protect other children from what she and Jacob had endured. At 16, she was already making waves as a young advocate for foster care reform. Her blog, Lila's Light, had gained a significant following, and her speaking engagements had taken her across the state. One quiet Saturday morning, as sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, Leela sat at the dining table with Jessica, reviewing a draft for a letter to the state legislature. "It's really powerful, Lila," Jessica said, her voice filled with pride. "You're asking for exactly the right things. Better screening for foster parents, more funding for mental health resources, and support for kids aging out of the system." Leela chewed her bottom lip. "Do you think they'll listen?" Jessica reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You've already made people listen. Keep going." Jacob wandered into the room, holding a drawing he'd just finished. He placed it proudly in front of Leela. "It's us," he said, pointing to the stick figures. "You're on the stage talking, and I'm clapping really loud." Leela laughed, pulling him into a hug. "You're my biggest fan, huh?" "Always," Jacob said with a grin, his missing front tooth making him look even more adorable. Later that month, Leela received a call that would change everything. Erin Daniels, the social worker who had been instrumental in helping her navigate the advocacy world, was on the line. "Leela," Erin said, her tone buzzing with excitement, "I just got word that the National Youth Advocacy Conference wants you to speak. It's a big deal. They're flying in young leaders from all over the country." Leela's breath caught in her throat. "They want me?" "Yes, you," Erin replied, laughing. "Your story and your work have inspired so many people. This is your chance to take it to the next level." The conference was set to take place in Washington, D.C., and Leela immediately began preparing. She spent late nights crafting her speech, determined to make it perfect. Jessica and Michael supported her every step of the way, while Jacob offered moral support in the form of snacks and drawings. On the day of the conference, Leela stood backstage at the Grand Auditorium, her heart pounding. She peeked through the curtains at the massive crowd, which included policymakers, child welfare advocates, and fellow survivors. "You've got this," Erin said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Just be yourself." When Leela stepped onto the stage, the spotlight was blinding, but she took a deep breath and began. "My name is Leela Johnson," she started, her voice steady despite the nerves coursing through her. "I was once a child who thought my voice didn't matter. But I'm here to tell you that every voice matters, especially the voices of children." She spoke about the flaws in the foster care system, sharing her own story of survival and resilience. She painted a vivid picture of the changes needed to protect vulnerable children, her words ringing with passion and purpose. "The system isn't broken because of a lack of care," she said. "It's broken because the voices of the children it's meant to protect are often ignored. That has to change. We have to listen, believe, and act." By the time she finished, the audience was on its feet, applauding loudly. Leela stepped off the stage to find Erin waiting with open arms. "You were amazing," Erin said, tears in her eyes. "I'm so proud of you." After the conference, Leila's life became a whirlwind. Her speech went viral, and her blog saw a surge in followers. She began collaborating with national organizations, advocating for policy changes, and organizing support networks for foster youth. Jacob, meanwhile, was thriving in his own way. With the help of his counselor, he had started to come out of his shell, making friends at school and excelling in art class. He often accompanied Leila to her events, proudly introducing himself as Leila's little brother. One evening, as the siblings sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jacob turned to Leila with a serious expression. "Do you think Mom and Dad would be proud of us?" he asked softly. Leila blinked back tears, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "I know they would be. They believed in standing up for what's right, and that's exactly what we're doing." Jacob nodded, leaning into her side. "I miss them." "I do too," Leila said, her voice thick with emotion. "But they're always with us in everything we do." The following year, Leila launched the Hope for Tomorrow Initiative, a nonprofit organization aimed at supporting foster youth and advocating for systemic reform. The initiative provided mentorship programs, emergency funding for foster families, and advocacy training for young people who wanted to make a difference. One of the first events organized by the initiative was a community rally held in the park where Leila had spoken for the first time. Hundreds of people gathered, carrying signs that read, "Every child deserves a voice," and "Foster change now." Leila stood at the podium, flanked by Jacob and her team, as she addressed the crowd. "This is just the beginning," she declared, her voice ringing with confidence. "Together, we can create a system that values every child, listens to their voices, and gives them the support they deserve. Let's make tomorrow better, together." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Jacob raised his fist in the air, grinning from ear to ear. In the quiet moments that followed the rally, Leila reflected on how far they had come. The scared, silenced girl she had once been was now a leader, a beacon of hope for others. Jacob was no longer the frightened boy locked in a basement, but a thriving, happy child with a bright future ahead. Their journey wasn't over. There were still battles to fight, both personal and systemic. But as they stood together, surrounded by love and support, Leila knew they could face whatever came next. The past had shaped them, but it did not define them. Together, they were building a legacy of resilience, hope, and change, one step at a time. A legacy of light. The years passed swiftly, carrying Leila and Jacob into new chapters of their lives. By the time Leila turned 21, she was not just a survivor, she was a force of change. Her nonprofit organization, Hope for Tomorrow Initiative, had grown beyond her wildest dreams. With chapters in multiple states, it had become a lifeline for foster youth and a powerful voice for systemic reform. But for Leila, the most meaningful impact came in the quiet personal connections she made with the children she served. Jacob, now 13, had flourished under the Sanders' care. His natural talent for art had blossomed, and his colorful, imaginative drawings often found their way into Leila's work. One of his pieces, a depiction of a child holding a lantern in the dark, had become the official logo for Hope for Tomorrow. It symbolized their shared belief that even the smallest light could illuminate the darkest places. On the evening of Hope for Tomorrow's annual gala, Leila found herself standing backstage in the grand ballroom of a downtown hotel. The event had drawn influential figures from across the country, including lawmakers, social workers, and advocates. Leila glanced at her reflection in a nearby mirror, adjusting the simple silver necklace that had belonged to her mother. It was a small way of keeping her parents close to her heart on such an important night. Jessica and Michael had arrived early, their pride evident as they mingled with other guests. Jacob was there too, wearing a suit for the first time and grinning ear to ear as he admired the artwork on display. His artwork. "You ready?" Aaron Daniels asked, stepping beside Leila with a warm smile. Leila nodded, taking a deep breath. "I think so." When she walked onto the stage, the audience erupted into applause. The sight of hundreds of people standing in support of her mission brought tears to her eyes, but she steadied herself and began her speech. "Good evening," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "When I was a child, I thought the world was a place where people didn't listen, where children like me and my brother could be ignored, forgotten, and left to fend for ourselves. But tonight, looking out at all of you, I see proof that the world can change." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen alone. It happens when people like you choose to care, to act, and to believe that every child deserves a voice. I stand here today because people believed in me. And now, it's my turn, and our turn, to believe in the millions of children still waiting to be heard. As she spoke, a slideshow played behind her, showcasing the stories of children whose lives had been transformed by Hope for Tomorrow. Leila shared a few of their stories. Of a girl named Priya who had found her passion for coding through the initiative's mentorship program. Of a boy named Daniel who had reunited with his siblings after years of separation. And of a teenager named Emma who had discovered her voice through poetry workshops. "These children remind us why we fight," Leila said. "They are the reason we will never stop." The room erupted in applause once more as Leila finished her speech. She stepped off the stage, her heart full as she was greeted by Jacob, who hugged her tightly. "You were amazing," he said, his voice filled with pride. "So were you," Leila replied, gesturing to his artwork displayed prominently near the stage. "Your light inspires me every day." In the days following the gala, Leila received countless messages of support and gratitude. Among them was a letter from a woman named Marta Espinosa, who worked for an international child welfare organization. Marta had been moved by Leila's speech and wanted to discuss the possibility of expanding Hope for Tomorrow's reach beyond the United States. The idea excited and terrified Leila. She had always dreamed of helping as many children as possible, but the thought of leading such a massive effort was daunting. She turned to Jessica for advice. "Do you think I'm ready for this?" Leila asked one evening as they sat on the back porch, the stars twinkling above them. Jessica smiled, her eyes filled with maternal warmth. I think you've been ready for a long time, Layla. You have a gift, not just for seeing the problems, but for inspiring others to help solve them. If anyone can do this, it's you. The next year was a whirlwind. Layla traveled to conferences and meetings around the world, learning from other advocates and sharing her own insights. Jacob often joined her on trips during his school breaks, and together they visited shelters, foster homes, and youth centers. Everywhere they went, Jacob brought his sketchpad, capturing the people and places they encountered. In a small village in Guatemala, they met a boy named Luis, who had been separated from his siblings after losing his parents. His story reminded Layla of her own, and she worked tirelessly to connect him with a local organization that could help reunite his family. In India, they visited a group home where young girls learned to sew and create handmade crafts to support themselves. Jacob proudly gifted them one of his drawings, and the girls responded with warm smiles and laughter. Each experience deepened Layla's resolve and broadened her perspective. She realized that while the challenges faced by foster children varied across cultures, the need for love, safety, and belonging was universal. By the time Layla turned 25, Hope for Tomorrow had become an international movement. The organization provided not only advocacy and mentorship, but also direct support for foster children and families in need. Its programs ranged from emergency housing to educational scholarships to therapy services. On the anniversary of her parents' passing, Layla organized a memorial event in their honor. Held in the park where she had first shared her story, the event brought together friends, family, and supporters from around the world. Layla stood at the podium, her voice strong and clear as she spoke of her parents' legacy. "They taught me that one voice can spark a revolution," she said. "And that love, even when it's lost, can leave behind a light that never fades. My parents' fight for justice lives on, not just in me, but in all of you." As the crowd lit candles and held them high, Layla felt a profound sense of peace. The pain of the past would always be with her, but it no longer defined her. She had taken the darkness and transformed it into something beautiful, something powerful. Jacob stood beside her, now a confident teenager with a quiet strength that mirrored her own. Together, they looked out at the sea of lights, their bond unbreakable. For the first time in years, Layla allowed herself to dream of a future not only for herself and Jacob, but for every child who needed hope. The past had shaped her, but the future was hers to create, a legacy of light that would shine for generations to come, a beacon for the future. By the time Layla turned 30, her life was a testament to resilience, determination, and the enduring power of hope. What had started as a personal fight for justice had grown into a global movement. Hope for Tomorrow now operated in over 20 countries, partnering with governments, nonprofits, and grassroots organizations to create systemic change for foster children. But with growth came challenges. Layla often found herself torn between the responsibilities of leading an international organization and the personal connections that had always fueled her passion. Jacob, now 18 and preparing to leave for art school, often teased her about being a celebrity advocate. But beneath the jokes, there was deep pride in his voice. He had flourished in his own right, his artwork earning him recognition and scholarships. His talent for capturing raw emotion on canvas made him a rising star in the art world. One crisp autumn morning, Layla sat in her office in the bustling headquarters of Hope for Tomorrow. The walls were lined with photos from their initiatives around the world, smiling children, bustling workshops, and rebuilt homes. But her gaze lingered on a single framed picture of her younger self with Jacob, taken shortly after they had escaped the Carters. It reminded her of why she had started this journey. Her assistant, Priya, one of the first children helped by Hope for Tomorrow, knocked gently on the door. "Layla, you have a call from the Secretary General's office." Layla blinked in surprise. "The UN Secretary General." Priya nodded with a grin. "They want to talk to you about a partnership." Layla picked up the phone, her heart racing. The call was brief but life-changing. The United Nations wanted her to speak at their annual summit on children's rights and work with them to draft an international framework for improving foster care systems worldwide. A month later, Leela stood in the Grand Assembly Hall of the United Nations in New York City. The room was filled with world leaders, activists, and dignitaries. As she approached the podium, she felt the familiar rush of nerves. But when she glanced at the audience, her gaze fell on Jacob, sitting proudly in the front row with Jessica and Michael beside him. Her parents' silver necklace felt warm against her skin, a quiet reminder of their enduring presence. "My name is Leela Johnson," she began, her voice steady. "And I am here not just as an advocate, but as someone who lived through the failings of the foster care system. My brother and I were once forgotten, invisible. But through the kindness of strangers and the determination of those who believed in us, we found our way to safety, healing, and purpose." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. But not every child gets that chance. Today, millions of children remain in the shadows, their voices unheard, their needs unmet. We cannot call ourselves a just society until every child has the opportunity to thrive. Her speech was both a call to action and a blueprint for change. She outlined the successes of Hope for Tomorrow and the lessons learned from working across cultures. She proposed specific policies, from mandatory mental health support for foster children to international safeguards against exploitation. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. As she stepped off the stage, representatives from multiple countries approached her, eager to collaborate. The summit marked a turning point, not just for Leela, but for Hope for Tomorrow. Within a year, the organization became a key partner in drafting the Global Child Welfare Accord, a groundbreaking international agreement that sets standards for foster care and child protection. Leila's voice had helped shape a document that would impact millions of children worldwide. But for all her success, Leela never lost sight of the personal connections that had always driven her. She spent time visiting local chapters of Hope for Tomorrow, meeting children, and mentoring young advocates. One such visit brought her back to the small park where she had given her first speech years ago. A local Hope for Tomorrow chapter had organized an art show featuring works by foster youth. Among the artists was a shy 10-year-old girl named Amara, whose large, expressive eyes reminded Leela of her younger self. Amara's painting depicted a girl standing in the rain, holding a bright yellow umbrella. "It's me," Amara explained softly when Leela complimented her work. "The umbrella is my hope." Leela crouched down to meet her gaze. "It's beautiful," she said. "Never let go of your hope, Amara. It's what makes you strong." Meanwhile, Jacob was making his own mark on the world. His art exhibitions drew crowds and critical acclaim, but he often donated the proceeds to Hope for Tomorrow. His latest project was a series of portraits of foster children, each one capturing the resilience and individuality of his subjects. The series, titled Unseen No More, was set to tour internationally, bringing attention to the experiences of foster youth. At the opening of the exhibit in Paris, Jacob gave a short speech. "Art has always been my way of making sense of the world," he said. "But this project isn't about me. It's about giving a voice to the kids who are too often overlooked. Kids like me and my sister once were." Leela, standing in the audience, wiped away tears as the crowd erupted in applause. She couldn't have been prouder of Jacob's journey. From a scared boy locked in a basement to a confident young man using his talent to inspire change. Back at home, Jessica and Michael decided to turn their own experiences into action. With Leila's encouragement, they opened a small foster home designed to provide not just shelter but a true sense of belonging. They named it the Right House in honor of Leela and Jacob's parents, whose values had inspired so much of their work. On the day the house opened, the Sanders family gathered for a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Leila stood with Jessica and Michael, Jacob at her side. "This house is more than just a place to live," Michael said in his speech. "It's a promise that every child who walks through these doors will be seen, heard, and loved." As the years went on, Leila's legacy continued to grow. She became a sought-after speaker and advisor, helping to shape child welfare policies in countries around the world. Jacob's art remained a powerful tool for advocacy, with his work featured in museums and galleries. But no matter how busy their lives became, Leila and Jacob never lost sight of what truly mattered. Every year, on the anniversary of their parents' passing, they visited the park where their journey of healing had begun. They sat on a bench beneath the tall oak tree, reflecting on how far they had come. One year, as they sat in comfortable silence, Jacob broke it with a question. "Do you ever think about what Mom and Dad would say if they were here?" Leila smiled, looking up at the sky. "I think they'd say they're proud of us. And I think they'd tell us to keep going." Jacob nodded, his eyes misty but filled with determination. "Then we'll keep going." And so they did, carrying forward a legacy of love, resilience, and hope. Together, they became not just survivors, but beacons of light for a world in need. A light that never fades. Years later, Leila Johnson's name had become synonymous with advocacy for foster youth. At 40, she was recognized globally as a changemaker, a woman who had turned her pain into purpose. Yet despite her accolades and influence, Leila remained grounded, holding tight to the values that had guided her since she first found her voice. Jacob, now in his late 20s, had become a celebrated artist, his work blending vivid color with raw emotion. His exhibitions drew international acclaim, but his greatest pride lay in his collaboration with Hope for Tomorrow. Together with Leila, he launched Art of Healing, a program that used art therapy to help foster youth express their emotions and process their trauma. Despite their busy lives, the siblings made time for family and reflection. Jessica and Michael Sanders were now in their 60s, having fostered over a dozen children through the years. The Wright House, their small but thriving foster home, had become a model for similar initiatives across the country. It was a quiet winter evening when Leila received a letter that would set her on a new path. She had just returned home from a speaking engagement in Chicago, her suitcase still by the door, when she noticed the envelope on her kitchen table. It was handwritten, the script unfamiliar. Intrigued, she opened it. The letter was from a young woman named Elena Morales, a former foster child who had recently aged out of the system. Elena wrote about how Leila's story had inspired her, how Hope for Tomorrow had provided her with mentorship and guidance when she felt lost. "You showed me that my past doesn't define me," the letter read. "Because of you, I'm starting college next semester to study social work. I want to help kids the way you helped me. Thank you for being the light that guided me." Leila's eyes filled with tears as she read the words. She had received countless messages of gratitude over the years, but something about Elena's letter struck a deeper chord. It reminded her of why she had started this journey, to ensure no child felt invisible or forgotten. The next morning, Leila called Elena. The young woman was surprised but thrilled to hear from her. "I didn't think you'd actually read my letter," Elena admitted, her voice filled with nervous excitement. "I read every word," Leila replied warmly, "and I want to hear more about your story. If you're interested, I'd love to meet in person." They arranged to meet at a cafe in Elena's hometown the following week. When Leila arrived, she spotted Elena immediately, a petite young woman with dark hair pulled into a ponytail, her expression a mix of hope and trepidation. Over coffee, Elena shared her story. She had entered the foster system at 12 after her mother passed away and her father disappeared. She bounced between homes, some kind and others indifferent, until she found herself on her own at 18. It was through a Hope for Tomorrow mentorship program that she met Alicia, a social worker who helped her apply for college and find stable housing. "I used to think I didn't matter," Elena said, her voice trembling. "But seeing what you've done, it made me believe I could do something meaningful too." Leila reached across the table and took Elena's hand. "You already are," she said, "and I'm here to help you every step of the way." Elena's story reignited Leila's passion for mentorship. She began focusing more on empowering young adults who had aged out of the foster system, helping them navigate the challenges of independence. She expanded Hope for Tomorrow's programs to include scholarships, job placement services, and transitional housing. One of the most ambitious projects was the Wright Academy, a residential program that combined education, life skills training, and mental health support for foster youth aged 18 to 24. The academy was designed to bridge the gap between foster care and adulthood, ensuring no young person was left behind. Jacob played a key role in the academy's development, designing its art and therapy spaces. The opening ceremony was a deeply emotional moment for the siblings, who stood together at the ribbon cutting, surrounded by former foster children whose lives had been transformed by their work. "This isn't just a building," Leela said in her speech. "It's a promise that no child will have to navigate adulthood alone." As the academy flourished, so did Leela and Jacob's personal lives. Jacob married his longtime partner, a fellow artist named Ethan, and the two began fostering children of their own. Their home was filled with laughter, art supplies, and the joyful chaos of a growing family. Leela, meanwhile, found companionship in Dr. Amir Patel, a child psychologist she had met at a conference. Their shared passion for helping children brought them together, and over time, their relationship deepened into something neither had expected but both cherished. "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" Jacob teased her one evening as they sat together at a family dinner, watching the children play. "Not in a million years," Leela admitted, laughing. "But I wouldn't trade it for anything." As Leela approached her 50th birthday, her work showed no signs of slowing. The Global Child Welfare Accord had been adopted by over 80 countries, and Hope for Tomorrow had launched initiatives in some of the world's most underserved regions. Leela was invited to speak at the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony, where the organization was honored for its groundbreaking contributions to child welfare. In her acceptance speech, Leela reflected on her journey. "This award belongs to every child who refused to be silenced, every family who chose love over fear, and every advocate who believed change was possible. Together, we've shown that even the darkest stories can lead to the brightest futures." Back at home, Leela continued to focus on the individual connections that had always been her true calling. She mentored Elena through college, watching with pride as the young woman graduated with honors and began her career as a social worker. On the night of Elena's graduation, the two sat together on the steps of the Wright Academy, looking out at the lights of the city. "You know," Elena said, her voice thoughtful, "if it weren't for you, I don't think I'd be here." Leela smiled, her heart full. "And if it weren't for the people who believed in me, I wouldn't be here either. That's the beauty of it. We lift each other up." Elena nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "Then it's my turn to lift someone else." As the years went on, Leela's legacy continued to grow. She became a symbol of hope, not just for foster youth, but for anyone who had ever felt unseen. Her story was taught in schools, her speeches quoted in textbooks, and her organization used as a model for reform worldwide. But for Leela, the greatest legacy was the lives she had touched. Children like Elena, Priya, and Jacob, who had found their voices and were now using them to change the world. In the quiet moments, Leela often returned to the park where her journey began. Sitting beneath the old oak tree, she reflected on how far she and Jacob had come. The pain of their past had become the foundation for something extraordinary, a light that would never fade. And as the wind rustled the leaves above her, Leela whispered a promise to the parents she had lost so long ago. "We carried your fight forward, and we'll keep carrying it, always."